Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to another installment of our light study of selected Ahadeeth from Riyaadus Saaliheen. Today we'll be looking at the Hadith on the authority of Zubayr ibn Adi. قال أتينا أنس ابن مالك رضي الله عنه فشكونا إليه ما نلقى من الحجاج فقال اصبروا فإنه لا يأتي زمان إلا والذي بعده شر منه حتى تلقوا ربكم سمعته من نبيكم صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رواه البخاري. So this hadith on the authority of Zubayr ibn Adi, in it he said, we went to Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu and complained to him of our suffering at the hands of Al-Hajjaj. He replied, endure. For no time will come but will be followed by one worse than the present one, till you meet your Lord. I heard this from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa ala alihi wa sallam, and the hadith was collected by Bukhari rahimahullahu ta'ala. So in the hadith, when this group of tabi'een, this group of people from the second generation, they came to Anas ibn Malik and complained to him about Al-Hajjaj. And what is meant by Al-Hajjaj is Al-Hajjaj, or the person meant or intended is Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, who was an infamous governor he was an infamous governor during the caliphate of Abd'Llah ibn Marwan. Abd'Llah ibn Marwan. And he was notorious for his tyranny, for his bloodshed, for his brutality and his ruthlessness, to the point that Al-Sha'bi rahimahullah ta'ala, he narrated, he said, كان عمر فمن بعده إذا أخذوا العاصي أقاموه للناس ونزعوا إمامته فلما كان زياد ضرب في الجنايات بالسياط ثم زاد مصعب بن زبير حلق اللحية فلما كان بشر بن مروان سمر كف الجاني بمسمار فلما قدم الحجاج قال هذا كله لعب فقتل بالسيف. So Al-Sha'bi, he narrates, he says that Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, al-Khalifat al-Rashid, and those who succeeded him, when they apprehended a sinner, they shamed him by making him stand before the people and removing his turban. So that's pretty light. That basically there will be a public shaming of the sinner, and that's it. That's what they would do to the time of Umar and the caliphs that succeeded him. Then he says, when Ziyad came to power, he lashed people for criminal conduct. So now this is a step up in terms of severity, in terms of in terms of the severity of the penalty. Then he said, Mus'ab ibn Zubayr did likewise, but added shaving the sinner's beard. So Mus'ab ibn Zubayr did the same as Ziyad did, but he added to that he would shave the beard, so it will be an additional public shaming. So now the person will be known as a sinner, and he could be recognized or identified by the fact that his beard had been shaved. Then he said when Bishr ibn Marwan ascended to power, he would drive a nail through the palm of the perpetrator. So then this is even more severe. This is even more stringent of a penalty. And then, but he says, but when Al-Hajjaj came, he said, all of this is child's play. And he killed with the sword instead. So when people would commit sins, he would actually take their life. He would actually murder them. So in this hadith, when these people from the second generation, these tabi'een, when they came to Anas ibn Malik, and they felt that they could no longer bear the brutal tactics and oppressive treatment of Al-Hajjaj, they complained to Anas. And what we mean by when he says shakawna ila Anas, they means they asked Anas, what should we do? Given the circumstances, what should we do? What solution? What is the hell? What is the solution to this problem? And what did he tell them? Did he tell them to protest? Did he tell them to do demonstrations? Did he tell them to overthrow Al-Hajjaj, to try to assassinate him, etc.? No, rather he told them to be patient. He told them to endure. He said, Isbiru. And then he explained why he was giving them this advice. He said, فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَأْتِي زَمَانٌ إِلَّا وَالَّذِي بَعْدَهُ شَرٌ مِّنْهُ حَتَّى تَلْقَوْا رَبَّكُمْ. He said, because no time will come, but it will be followed by one worse than the present one till you meet your Lord. I heard this from your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now there's some similar narrations on the authority of Ibn Mas'ud, which add additional context and explain exactly what Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu intended. So one of those narrations is the one in which Ibn Mas'ud, he was quoted as saying, لا يأتي عليكم يوم إلا وهو شر من اليوم الذي كان قبله حتى تقوم الساعة لست أعني رخاء من العيش يصيبه ولا مالا يفيده ولكن لا يأتي عليكم يوم إلا وهو قل علما من اليوم الذي مضى قبله فإذا ذهب العلماء استوى الناس فلا يأمرون بالمعروف ولا ينهون المنكر فعند ذلك يهلكون. So he said, no day will come except that it is worse than the day before it, until the hour is established. I don't mean comfortable living a person enjoys, or wealth from which he benefits in a material sense. Rather, what I mean to say is that no day will come to you except that it is scarcer in knowledge than the day which passed before it. So when the scholars pass on or pass away, people will be on equal footing. They will not command the good or forbid the evil. At that point, they will suffer a miserable fate. In another version of the same narration from Ibn Mas'ud, he said, one of the people who had heard this from him, he said, فَأَصَابَتْنَا سَنَةٌ خَصِبٌ. So he said, when after hearing this we had a year of prosperity, we asked him about that. Meaning we went back to Ibn Mas'ud and said, hey, you told us that the year following 1 year is always going to be worse. So we're trying to understand how we should interpret that in light of the fact that this year is more prosperous materially than the previous year. Whereupon Ibn Mas'ud responded, he said, لَيْسَ ذَلِكَ أَعْنِي إِنَّمَا أَعْنِي ذَهَابَ الْعُلَمَاءِ. He said, that is not what I'm speaking of. I mean the passing of the scholars. Then there's one more narration that's worthy of mention, and that is the one in which Ibn Mas'ud was reported to have said, لا يأتي عليكم زمان إلا وهو أشر مما كان قبله. So he kind of repeats along the same lines, and then he says, ولكن علماؤكم وفقهاؤكم يذهبون ثم لا تجدون منهم خلفا ويجيء قوم يفتون برأيهم وفي لفظ عنه من هذا الوجه وما ذلك بكثرة الأمطار وقلتها ولكن بذهاب العلماء ثم يحدث قوم يفتون في الأمور برأيهم فيثلمون الإسلام ويهدمونه. So in this last narration, which is again, it gives context to what Anas said in the first narration, you will not witness an era, except that it will be worse than the one which preceded it. I don't mean a ruler better than another ruler or a year better than another year in terms of prosperity. Rather, I intend that your scholars and jurists will pass away. You will not find suitable replacements for them, and some people will come who will issue religious verdicts based purely upon personal opinion. They will ruin Islam and demolish it. So now, if we consider the context provided by Ibn Mas'ud to the original narration from Anas ibn Malik, we can conclude that these words, لا يأتي زمان إلا والذي بعده شر منه, no time will come except that the time which follows it will be worse than it, they convey the following meaning. One is that when faced with trials, generally, and the trial of wicked rulers specifically, Islam teaches us to exercise patience. And we can see that clearly by the statement of Anas ibn Malik in which he said, Isbiru. He said, be patient. The second thing is that we must follow this teaching of being patient under these circumstances, rather than our emotions and or our opinions. So we have to follow this teaching of Islam to be patient under these circumstances specifically, as opposed to following what our opinions tell us and our emotions tell us. The natural reaction, the knee-jerk reaction, is to fight back. But that's not what Islam teaches us to do, and there's a real good reason for that, as we're going to see shortly. Another thing that the context that Ibn Mas'ud's athar provide is that things will get worse, and the situation will be exacerbated by the scarcity of learned people. That means that people will have fewer learned people to turn to who will advise them in accordance with what Islam says. There will be fewer scholars and knowledgeable people who, when the people are upset, when the people are overwhelmed, when the people feel that they just can't take it anymore, and they want to know what they can do Islamically, there will be fewer people to tell them, be patient. This is what Islam says. There will be fewer people to tell them what Islam says under those circumstances. And as a result, there will be much confusion. And as a result of that, people with no knowledge will assume the role of muftis and will tell the people what to do in turbulent circumstances based upon what they think is right, not necessarily what Islam says. So there will be lots of people who will put themselves in that position. They will appoint themselves as the muftis of the people and tell the people, hey, you should do this and you should do that based upon the circumstances, based upon their personal opinions and their personal emotions and their feeling about the matter, as opposed to what Islam says. And these self-appointed muftis will also likely justify their verdicts by promises of prosperity, using prosperity as a carrot on the stick to goad people into doing things which are not consistent with the teachings of Islam. So they say, yeah, overthrow the ruler, fight back, demonstrate, protest, do that, because that will give you freedom. That will liberate you. That will put you in a position where you can have more money. You will have more material wealth. You'll have more property. They'll put that as a carrot on the stick. But Ibn Mas'ud, in his statements, what you consistently see is he says, I'm not talking about material prosperity. That's not really what's important. It's spiritual prosperity which is really important. And this is what will suffer, and this is what is at risk. And that brings us to the last point. We have to resist the temptation to listen to these people, these self-appointed muftis, who add evil to evil and harm to harm. We have to resist listening to them and being from the people who add evil to evil and harm to harm, and thereby accelerate the process of the increase of evil that Anas was talking about when he said, and Ibn Mas'ud as well, لا يأتي زمان إلا والذي بعده شر منه حتى تلقوا ربكم. He said that there will not come a time except the time after will be worse than it until you meet your Lord. Worse than it in what sense? In a material sense? No, in a spiritual sense. As Ibn Mas'ud explained, he said, أعني بذلك ذهاب علمائكم وفقهائكم. He said, I mean by that the passing away or the passing on of your scholars and your jurists. So now if we consider everything that we've said so far, we can conclude that the message of Anas to his pupils was this. Number one, when there is evil and we cannot eradicate it entirely, our duty is to minimize it so that it is less than it would be if we did nothing, or less than it would be if we did something that amounts to a greater evil, which would make the situation worse, which is why Anas told them, isbiru, be patient. Because if you do something, then what you do is going to make the evil even worse, and in Islam, we're not allowed to respond in a way which makes the evil worse, because our job is to what? Is to minimize the evil if we cannot totally eradicate it. The second thing we see, or the second message from what Anas said, is that it is as if Anas is telling them, look, things are bad right now. I'll be the first to admit it. But our Prophet told us that things will always get what? Will get incrementally worse. That tomorrow will be worse than today, and the day after tomorrow will be worse than tomorrow, etc. So you have to be patient. You have to learn to exercise patience. Why? Because if you can't be patient now when it's less evil, when there's less oppression, how will you be patient when there's more evil and more oppression? And then last but not least, number 3, Anas is teaching us that the general rule in Islam is that it is not permissible. لا يجوز دفع مفسدة بمفسدة هي أعظم منها أو هي أشد منها. It is not permissible for us to respond to a wrongdoing, to an act of oppression, to a crime in a way that is likely or potentially, or that is likely to make it worse or will potentially make it worse. Specifically, it is not permissible to try to overthrow or fight back, overthrow a ruler or fight back, because rulers almost invariably respond with even greater brutality and bloodshed. And if you want to look for an example, you don't have to look very far. Just look at modern day Syria. Just that's one example out of many that we could quote from the present age and even from history, where when people tried to overthrow the ruler responded with even more brutality and even more bloodshed. And after the dust settles and people can kind of reflect upon the decisions they made, they almost invariably regret having tried to what? To fight fire with fire and to fight the brutality of the ruler with brutality and with coups, etc. And if you look at Syria, for example, they were made promises by certain people, by certain external forces, by certain nations which sought to benefit from the conflict, sought to benefit from the coup. And when it became clear that the coup was not going to be successful, that these militias and these revolutionary groups and these groups which were intent on overthrowing the government were not going to be successful no matter how much money and weaponry was given to them, that they were going to be crushed by the regime, those same countries and nations, those foreign countries, they backed out and left them there. And now they are there to deal with the brunt of the brutality of the ruler. And so, no matter how evil the ruler, what Islam teaches us historically, and there's so many examples we could give, what Islam teaches us historically is that no matter how evil the ruler is, patience and personal improvement is the Islamic remedy for that situation. We always have to remember the Arabic proverb that says, كَمَا تَكُونُوا يُوَلَّى عَلَيْكُمْ. As you are, so will your rulers be. That our rulers are a reflection of our own selves. And so if we improve ourselves, then the rulers that we have will improve. We'll get better rulers. The better we are, the better the rulers who rule over us will be. كَمَا تَكُونُوا يُوَلَّى عَلَيْكُمْ. As you are, so will your rulers be. So in closing, there's an obvious question. What is the connection between this hadith and the theme of the chapter, which is hastening to do good deeds? And the answer, Allah knows best, is that hastening to do good deeds encompasses minimizing evil. And being patient, because patience obviously is one of the greatest good deeds that you can possibly do. And we talked about that extensively in the bab of sabr, the bab of patience, or the chapter of patience. So one connection is that hastening to do good deeds encompasses or includes minimizing evil. And that's what Anas basically was telling the people. That look, it's difficult, it's tough, but isbiru, endure. Be patient, and your endurance and your patience is a good deed that you can do. And by not responding with evil, you are minimizing evil, and that's also a good deed that you can do, and you should hasten to do that. The second connection is that it's as if Anas is teaching us, or this hadith is teaching us, that we must never use our circumstances as an excuse not to do good, not to do the right thing. The right thing in this case being to be patient. But they were suffering so much at the hands of Al-Hajjaj, they wanted to do something. They wanted to ignore what Islam said, and they wanted to act. And so Anas is saying, I know it's bad, but don't use your situation as an excuse not to do good deeds. Do good deeds. Hasten to do those good deeds. And don't use your circumstances as an excuse not to do good deeds. It's important for us, brothers and sisters, that there are instances where it may be that someone has transgressed against us. And we meet that person in the masjid. And what Islam tells us to do is, because that person is a Muslim, is to give them the salam. And we allow our circumstances and the way that we feel about what the person did to us or said about us, we allow that to let us not, or to make ourselves feel justified in not giving the salams. And so what Anas is saying, and what Anas is saying in a roundabout way, or the connection between Anas' narration and the actual theme of the chapter, hasten to good deeds, is, hey, don't let your circumstances be an excuse to not do the good thing, not to do the good deed. As the Prophet said in one hadith, he said, لا يحل للمسلم أن يهجر أخاه المسلم فوق ثلاث. It's not permissible for one Muslim to boycott his brother Muslim for more than what? For more than 3 days. So you see a Muslim and there's been something between you and him or her, etc., you give the salams because it's the right thing to do. And you don't let the circumstances be an excuse not to do a good deed. So with that, we'll bring today's session to a close. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who He teaches beneficial knowledge. And we truly allow us to benefit from that knowledge by making us from those who put into practice. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.